Each year, military forces operating in extreme Arctic environments report encounters with atmospheric phenomena and psychological disturbances that seem to transcend conventional explanations of cold weather combat stress, altitude sickness, or sensory deprivation caused by the endless white landscapes and perpetual winter darkness. It happens so frequently that specialized research divisions within the U.S. Army Cold Regions, Research and Engineering Laboratory, the Soviet Arctic Military Districts, and NATO's Northern Command have invested over $200 million annually since the 1950s into studying what they clinically term Arctic combat dissociative episodes, though the classified files contain testimonies that suggest something far more sinister than mere psychological breakdown. The Winter War of 1939 to 1940 saw Finland's vastly outnumbered military forces, consisting of roughly 300,000 troops, face off against the Soviet Union's massive invasion force of over 760,000 soldiers in temperatures that regularly plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius, creating a frozen hellscape where frostbite could claim fingers in minutes and exhaled breath froze into ice crystals before hitting the ground. A perfect storm of human desperation, ancient superstition, and conditions so extreme that the boundary between the living world and something older became dangerously permeable. For a brief period during the darkest weeks of December 1939, one American military observer unit operating in the remote forests of Finnish Lapland would witness something so profoundly terrifying and ancient that it would result in the immediate establishment of Protocol Winter 7, a classified directive that forbids any NATO military personnel from entering specific coordinates in northern Finland, under any circumstances, with violators subject to immediate court-martial and permanent psychological evaluation. But what exactly was the entity that a desperate group of indigenous Sami villagers awakened through a forbidden blood ritual meant to protect their ancestral lands from Soviet invasion? And why did an entire platoon of battle-hardened Finnish ski troops simply vanish into the snow-covered forests, leaving behind only their weapons, their equipment, and bodies so perfectly preserved by the extreme cold that they looked like wax sculptures frozen in expressions of absolute existential terror? The Finnish region of Lapland sprawls across approximately 100,367 square kilometers of the northernmost territory of Finland, extending well beyond the Arctic Circle into a landscape so utterly dominated by endless coniferous forests, frozen lakes, and windswept tundra that even in modern times it remains one of the most sparsely populated regions in all of Europe, with a population density of barely 2 people per square kilometer. During the winter months of 1939, this region experienced what meteorologists would later classify as one of the harshest winters in recorded Scandinavian history, with temperatures consistently remaining between -30 and -45 degrees Celsius for weeks on end, creating an environment where exposed skin could develop frostbite in under 3 minutes, where motor oil froze solid in vehicle engines, and where the air itself seemed to crystallize into billions of suspended ice particles that created an eerie, shimmering atmosphere. Locals called Jayasumu, the ice fog that reduced visibility to mere meters and played tricks on even the most experienced wilderness navigators' senses. The forests in this region consist primarily of ancient Norwegian spruce and Scots pine that have stood for centuries, their branches so heavily laden with snow and ice that they bend nearly to the ground, creating natural tunnels and chambers beneath them, where the temperature, strangely enough, remains several degrees warmer than the exposed air above, and where the Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of this unforgiving landscape, have hidden their most sacred sites and performed their most secret ceremonies for over 3,000 years, believing that certain groves and stone circles possess a spiritual significance so profound that disturbing them would invite catastrophic supernatural retribution. It is perhaps unsurprising then that this isolated, frozen wilderness, where ancient traditions collide with modern warfare, where temperatures descend to levels that test the absolute limits of human endurance, and where the winter darkness lasts for nearly 20 hours each day, would become the staging ground for an encounter that would forever blur the line between protective ancestral spirits and malevolent entities that view all human presence as an intolerable violation of sacred ground. The Sami people, whose presence in Lapland predates written history by at least 4 millennia, developed elaborate spiritual traditions centered around what they called Saivo, a parallel realm of spirits and ancestors that existed beneath lakes, inside specific mountains, and within certain forest groves marked by arrangements of stones that formed patterns only visible from directly above. Patterns that some modern archaeologists suggest may have astronomical significance dating back to the Bronze Age. Their oral histories, meticulously preserved through generations of Noaidi, shamanic practitioners, speak extensively of a particularly fearsome guardian entity they referred to as Anskoti, which translates from Old Norse roots to mean the one who harvests breath, or more literally the devourer of souls, described in chants and songs as a pale figure that walks the winter forests during the Skabmamanu, the darkest month, appearing only when blood has been spilled on ground consecrated by specific rituals, and that it would emerge from the boundary between Saivo and the mortal world to reclaim what had been desecrated by extracting the very life essence from those responsible, leaving behind bodies that appeared physically intact but utterly hollow, as if everything that made them human had been drawn out through some incomprehensible process. Swedish colonial records from the 1600s, when Lutheran missionaries attempted to convert Sami communities and suppress their pagan practices, contain disturbing accounts from a priest named Anders Nilsson Gran, who documented in his diary dated January 1642 that he witnessed the aftermath of what locals claimed was an Anskoti manifestation, describing 17 Russian fur traders found frozen in a perfect circle around a Sami sacred stone, their bodies showing no signs of violence, but their faces locked in expressions he described as more terrible than any torture could produce, as if they had gazed upon the face of something that showed them the emptiness of their own souls. Emptiness of their own souls. And noting that the local Sami refused to approach the site for 3 full years afterward, claiming the ground itself had been marked by breath theft. Norwegian military records from 1809 during the Napoleonic Wars, when Swedish and Russian forces clashed in northern Scandinavia, contain a classified report from Colonel Henrik Angel, documenting the disappearance of an entire 40-man Russian reconnaissance company near what his Sami guides called Forbidden Ground, with a search party recovering the bodies 5 days later arranged in a spiral pattern in the snow, perfectly preserved by the extreme cold, but exhibiting what the military surgeon described as complete desiccation of all internal organs, despite no external wounds, as if every drop of moisture and animating force had been drawn from their bodies by some unknown mechanism, leaving them as mere husks wearing human skin. The Finnish Defense Forces, despite their relatively recent establishment as an independent military organization, following Finland's declaration of independence from Russia in 1917, inherited extensive archives from both Swedish and Russian occupation periods that contained at least 9 separate documented incidents between 1867 and 1938 involving military personnel who violated Sami sacred sites and subsequently experienced catastrophic casualties under circumstances that defied conventional military investigation. One particularly detailed case from February 1921 involved a Finnish army surveying team under Captain Lauri Christian Vorinen, who were mapping potential defensive positions in northern Lapland and, despite explicit warnings from local Sami communities, established a temporary camp directly atop what they dismissed as a primitive stone arrangement, only to have 3 of the 7-man team found dead the following morning in their sleeping bags, their bodies showing core temperatures of -15 degrees Celsius despite having been inside insulated tents with functioning portable heaters, their faces frozen in rictus expressions, and most disturbingly, their bodies weighing approximately 23 kilograms less than their recorded weights from the previous day's medical check, as if some substantial portion of their physical mass had simply vanished overnight. The Soviet NKVD, Stalin's feared secret police organization, maintained classified files on what they termed localized mass psychosis events in contested northern territories, documenting at least 4 separate incidents between 1932 and 1938, where Red Army units deployed to intimidate Finnish border communities reported encountering what one surviving lieutenant described in his interrogation transcript as a manifestation that moved through our encampment like winter fog, and wherever it passed, men simply collapsed, their last breaths emerging from their mouths as visible darkness that the entity seemed to inhale before moving to its next victim. Though the lieutenant was subsequently declared mentally unfit for service and disappeared into the Gulag Sovstem, while his entire report was stamped with classifications that officially rendered it non-existent in all Soviet military databases. Similar encounters were reported by Finnish Civil Guard units conducting winter training exercises in Lapland throughout the 1930s, with a pattern emerging that suggested something profoundly disturbing, that certain locations, when desecrated by military presence, particularly during the darkest winter months, when combined with bloodshed on the ground itself, seemed to trigger manifestations of something that had existed in these forests long before any modern nation claimed sovereignty over this frozen wilderness. Something that ancient peoples had learned to appease through careful ritual and respectful distance. Something that viewed all warfare as an intolerable violation of boundaries that transcended any human understanding of territory or conflict. December 18th, 1939, 14:30 hours. The temperature hovering at a bone-crushing -38 degrees Celsius with wind chill factors pushing the effective temperature down to -50, conditions so extreme that simply breathing the air caused ice crystals to form inside the lungs and made every inhalation feel like swallowing shards of broken glass. Sergeant First Class Nathan Aldrich Brennan, a 32-year-old career military observer from the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps who had earned the nickname Frost during his previous assignment documenting cold weather tactics in Alaska, led a 6-man American observer team deep into the forests of Finnish Lapland, approximately 47 kilometers northeast of the small village of Inari, tasked with documenting and analyzing the unconventional guerrilla tactics that the vastly outnumbered Finnish forces were employing with devastating effectiveness against the Soviet invasion. Brennan's team included First Lieutenant Robert Hayes Kellerman, a Princeton-educated military strategist known as Professor for his habit of lecturing anyone who would listen about historical warfare tactics. Technical Sergeant James Patrick Doherty Mick, a combat engineer from Boston's Irish neighborhoods who could rig explosives in his sleep. Corporal Vincent Leroux, Vinny, a French-Canadian marksman whose grandfather had been a fur trapper in these same northern forests. Private First Class William Hutchins, Hutch, a medic from rural Montana who had grown up hunting in similar wilderness conditions, and Private Leonard Kozlowski Kowalski, a Chicago boy who had never faced a winter as brutal as the Arctic, despite 3 months of specialized cold weather training. The team had established a temporary observation post in a dense cluster of ancient spruce trees on a ridgeline that provided excellent sight lines across a frozen valley where Finnish ski troops had ambushed a Soviet armored column just 2 days prior. The wreckage of burned-out tanks and transport vehicles still smoking faintly in the distance, dark smudges against the endless expanse of white. Brennan was reviewing his tactical notes, his frost-covered pencil barely making legible marks on paper that had become brittle in the extreme cold, when Corporal Leroux, who had been scanning the valley floor through binoculars, suddenly went rigid and whispered in a tone that immediately commanded attention. "Sarge, there's something moving down there near that destroyed T-26, but it ain't dressed like any Finn or Russian I've ever seen. Looks like someone wrapped completely in white cloth just standing there next to the tank like the cold don't even touch them." Brennan took the binoculars, adjusted the focus with fingers that had lost most of their feeling, despite 3 layers of gloves, and felt his stomach tighten as he observed the figure Leroux had spotted, a humanoid shape approximately 200 meters distant, that appeared to be draped entirely in fabric or material that was almost luminescent against the snow, perfectly motionless, in a way that no living person could maintain in this temperature. And as Brennan watched, he noticed something that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. The figure was casting no shadow despite the weak afternoon sun, and the snow around it, for a radius of perhaps 10 meters, had taken on a strange blue-gray tinge that seemed to pulse very faintly like something breathing. Lieutenant Kellerman moved up beside Brennan to take his turn with the binoculars, his academic demeanor evaporating instantly as he studied the figure, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he muttered, "That's not possible. The temperature around that figure has to be significantly lower than the ambient air because I can see the distortion, like heat waves and reverse cold waves if such a thing could exist, and Jesus Christ, Sarge, I just saw it move, but it didn't walk, it just sort of shifted position without any transitional movement like watching a photograph change. The entire team was now focused on the valley floor, and as they watched through various optical equipment, the figure began moving with increasing purpose toward the wreckage of a Soviet transport truck approximately 50 meters from its initial position. And the movement was profoundly wrong in a way that bypassed rational analysis and struck directly at some primal survival instinct buried deep in the human brain, because the figure didn't walk so much as glide across the snow without disturbing it, leaving absolutely no footprints or tracks despite the powder being at least half a meter deep. And wherever it passed, the air itself seemed to shimmer and darken slightly, as if light was being absorbed rather than reflected. Technical Sergeant Doherty, who had seen combat in the Philippines and China and prided himself on maintaining composure under fire, had his service binoculars pressed so hard against his eye sockets that they would leave deep bruises, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow as he reported in a strained voice, "There's something coming out of that truck. Looks like a Soviet soldier crawling out of the cargo bed, probably been hiding there since the ambush, and oh God, oh Jesus, that white thing just turned toward him. And the cold around it is spreading. I can see the snow crystallizing in patterns like frost on a window, geometric shapes that ain't natural." The team watched in absolute silence as the Soviet soldier, who appeared injured and was dragging himself through the snow with agonizing slowness, suddenly seemed to notice the approaching figure and began screaming, the sound carrying faintly across the frozen valley as a thin, desperate wail that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made Brennan's teeth ache and his inner ear throb with nauseating pressure. Private Hutchins, the medic, instinctively started to rise, professional training overriding self-preservation as he prepared to move towards someone in medical distress. But Brennan grabbed his shoulder with a grip that was almost violent and hissed, "Stay down, Hutch, something's wrong here, something's very wrong." And the medic froze as they all watched the white figure close the distance to the Soviet soldier in what seemed like 3 impossibly long strides. And the temperature at their observation post, despite being 200 meters away and elevated above the valley floor, suddenly dropped precipitously, their breath clouds becoming so thick and white that it was like exhaling smoke, their exposed skin burning with cold that felt like liquid fire, and every electronic device they carried, the radio, Kellerman's wristwatch, Brennan's compass, began behaving erratically, needles spinning wildly, radio crackling with interference that sounded disturbingly like distant screaming, mixed with words in a language that predated any modern tongue. The Soviet soldiers' screaming intensified to a pitch that should have been impossible for human vocal cords to produce. A shriek of pure existential terror that seemed to resonate not just through the air but through the very ground itself, causing small vibrations that made the snow on nearby tree branches shower down in fine crystalline cascades. And then the white figure was upon him, standing directly over the prone soldier. And what happened next would be seared into the memories of every man in Brennan's team with such visceral clarity that they would relive it in nightmares for whatever remained of their lives. The figure, which they could now see, had a face consisting only of 2 points of cold luminescence, where eyes should be, and a void of absolute darkness beneath the hood where a mouth might exist, extended what might have been arms or appendages toward the soldier, and the Soviet man's body went completely rigid, back arching impossibly as if every muscle had contracted simultaneously. His mouth stretched open in a silent scream that produced no sound, and from his open mouth, from his eyes, from his ears, from every orifice in his body, something began to emerge. It was not breath, not steam, not anything they had words to describe, but rather a darkness that was visible against the white snow. A shadowy substance that flowed like smoke, but moved with obvious purpose and direction, streaming from the soldier's body into the white figure in tendrils and wisps that coalesced and were absorbed. And as this horrific extraction continued, the soldier's body began to physically collapse inward, as if he were being rapidly dehydrated or deflated, his winter uniform becoming loose and baggy as the mass beneath it diminished, his face sinking into the skull, eyes receding into their sockets, skin taking on a gray-blue pallor that made him look like he'd been dead for weeks rather than seconds. The process lasted perhaps 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours, and when it finally stopped, when the last wisp of that impossible darkness had been drawn from the soldier's body and consumed by the entity, What remained was a corpse that looked like a perfectly preserved mummy skin, stretched tight over bones with absolutely no muscle or tissue mass remaining between them. Clothing hanging on a frame that had lost at least half its original body weight, and most horrifying of all, the face was frozen in an expression of such absolute terror and despair that it transcended anything that combat or torture or natural death could produce. An expression that suggested the soldier had experienced something during those 30 seconds that revealed truths about existence and mortality that no human mind was meant to comprehend. Private Kowalski vomited violently into the snow beside him, the retching sound seeming obscenely loud in the terrible silence that followed, while Corporal LaRue was whispering in rapid French, prayers his grandmother had taught him as a child. Prayers he hadn't spoken in 20 years, and Brennan himself felt something fundamental break inside his tactical military mind, some certainty about the nature of reality and death that had been a foundational assumption of his entire worldview, because what they had just witnessed was not hallucination, was not cold weather psychosis, was not explainable by any natural phenomenon known to science or warfare. The white figure stood motionless for several long moments, the luminescence of its eyes now noticeably brighter than before, as if fed by what it had consumed. And then it slowly, deliberately turned its head upward toward the ridgeline where Brennan's team lay concealed. And despite the 200-meter distance, despite the dense forest cover, despite every rational argument against it being possible, Brennan knew with absolute certainty that the entity was looking directly at him, that it knew they were there, that it had known all along they were watching. And in that moment of horrible connection, he felt a cold that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature lance through his chest like a spear of ice driven directly into his heart. Brennan's military training kicked in with automatic precision, despite the existential horror still churning in his gut, his voice emerging as a harsh whisper that cut through the team's collective shock as he ordered, "Radio, now we need to report this to command immediately. Kellerman, get that transmitter operational and raise anybody on the Finnish command frequency. I don't care if it's a private or a general, we need reinforcements, and we need answers about what the hell we just witnessed down there." Lieutenant Kellerman fumbled with the portable SCR-300 radio unit, his hands shaking so badly from a combination of cold and adrenaline that he could barely manipulate the frequency dial. And when he finally managed to power the unit on, all that emerged from the speaker was a howling static that seemed to contain patterns within it. Rhythmic pulses that almost sounded like breathing, like something massive and ancient inhaling and exhaling in perfect synchronization with their own terrified respirations. And no matter how many times he adjusted the frequency or checked the connections, the result remained the same. No contact, no voices, just that terrible breathing static that made everyone who heard it feel fundamentally violated on some level they couldn't articulate. Brennan pulled out his backup compass, standard military issue that he'd carried through a dozen previous assignments without a single malfunction, and watched with growing dread as the needle spun lazily in complete circles, occasionally stopping to point in directions that made no geographical sense, as if magnetic north had ceased to exist or had been replaced by something else. Some other force that conventional instruments were never designed to detect. Technical Sergeant Doherty, trying desperately to impose some rational framework on what they'd witnessed, began examining the valley floor through a spotting scope equipped with a basic rangefinder, his voice taking on the forced calm of someone clinging to procedure as a lifeline against madness as he reported. Distance to the corpse is approximately 212 meters wind speed, looks minimal, maybe 3 to 5 knots from the northwest. Visibility is crystal clear, and that entity, it's still down there, Sarge. It's moved maybe 20 meters east toward that cluster of destroyed vehicles, and I'm getting temperature readings through my scope that don't make any goddamn sense, because it's reading negative 68 degrees in a 10-meter radius around that figure, when the ambient air temperature at valley floor level should be around negative 35, which means that thing is somehow generating or projecting cold that's more than 30 degrees below the environmental baseline. Private First Class Hutchins, whose medical training gave him a framework for processing trauma that the others lacked, was mentally cataloging what they'd observed with clinical detachment as a defense mechanism, muttering half to himself, "Complete desiccation of soft tissue, massive reduction in body mass, No visible hemorrhaging or fluid loss, which means whatever was extracted wasn't blood or lymph or any physical substance. It was something else, something that had mass and volume but wasn't material in any conventional sense, and the speed of the process suggests some kind of osmotic or pressure differential mechanism operating on a level that biology doesn't account for. Corporal LaRue, who had grown up hearing his Métis grandmother's stories about the Wendigo and other entities that haunted the northern forests, had gone deathly pale beneath his cold weather gear and was rocking slightly back and forth as he whispered, My mère warned me. She said there are things in the old forests that were here before us and will be here after we're gone. Things that we made treaties with in the old days. Things that don't forgive when the treaties are broken, and we shouldn't be here, Sarge. We shouldn't be anywhere near this place. Because that thing down there isn't hunting Russians or Finns, it's hunting anyone who brings war to this ground. As the team maintained their concealed position on the ridgeline, paralyzed between the instinct to flee and the military discipline that demanded they complete their observation mission, Lieutenant Kellerman pulled out a worn leather journal from his pack, something he'd acquired 3 days earlier from their Finnish liaison officer, a grizzled captain named Mäkinen, who had pressed it into Kellerman's hands with a haunted expression and instructions to read this if you see anything that can't be explained, and anything that makes the old stories seem less like superstition and more like warnings we should have heeded. The journal Kellerman now discovered as he flipped through pages with trembling fingers had been translated from an original Sami text dating back to approximately 1640, compiled by a Noaidi shaman named Aslak Eiríksson, who had documented the spiritual traditions and protective rituals of his people, and one section in particular marked with a red cloth bookmark that Mäkinen must have placed there described in disturbing detail an entity called Anskoti, which the translator had rendered into English as the Soul Harvester or the Breathtaker. According to Aslak's account, the Anskoti was not a demon or evil spirit in the Christian understanding, but rather an ancient guardian force that existed in the liminal space between the mortal world and Saivo, the Sami underworld or parallel realm of spirits, and it served a specific function: to protect sacred ground from desecration, particularly desecration through violence and bloodshed, by extracting the elan, the life force or soul essence, from those who violated the sanctified boundaries, and the extraction process was described in terms that perfectly matched what Brennan's team had just witnessed. The harvester appears as one clothed in the color of fresh snow, with eyes that shine like stars reflected in frozen lakes, and it moves between heartbeats, between breaths, bringing with it the cold that exists beyond death. And when it takes one who has spilled blood on forbidden ground, it draws from them not just life but the very animating essence that separates the living from the empty, leaving behind only the husk, the shell, the form without substance. The journal went on to explain that the Anskoti could only manifest when specific conditions were met. Sacred ground must be marked by the ancient stone circles that the Sami had erected thousands of years ago. Blood must be spilled upon that ground through violence rather than ritual sacrifice. And most critically, the entity must be summoned through a specific ceremony involving the sacrifice of something precious to the petitioners. Typically, their own blood offered voluntarily, creating a contract that bound the Anskoti to defend that territory against all intruders until the threat had been eliminated, or the summoners released it through an equally specific ritual of gratitude and dismissal. Kellerman's voice cracked as he read further and discovered a passage that made his blood run cold. Once awakened and bound to defend, the Anskoti recognizes no distinction between friend and foe, between invader and innocent, for all who bear weapons of war upon the sacred ground become targets of its harvest, and it will not rest until every soul marked by violence has been collected, or until the ground itself is reconsecrated through ceremonies known only to the eldest Noaidi and performed only at great personal cost. The lieutenant looked up from the journal, his academic composure completely shattered, and met Brennan's eyes with an expression of pure horror as he whispered, "Sarge, if this is accurate, and based on what we just saw, I have no reason to doubt its accuracy. Then someone in this region deliberately summoned this thing to fight the Soviet invasion, which means it's actively hunting any military presence in this entire area. And we've got Soviet and Finnish forces scattered across maybe 100 square kilometers of territory that could all be considered part of this sacred ground if the stone circles extend as far as the journal suggests. And that thing down there won't stop until it's harvested every last one of them, or us. The team's discussion of their rapidly deteriorating situation was cut short by a sound that drifted up from the valley floor, a sound so fundamentally wrong that it caused every man to freeze mid-breath. The grinding, scraping noise of the Soviet soldier's corpse moving not with the jerky reanimation of cinematic zombies, but with smooth, purposeful movements that suggested something was operating the dried husk like a puppet, using it as a vessel to accomplish some task that required physical form. Through their optical equipment, they watched in mounting horror as the desiccated body rose to its feet with mechanical precision, joints that should have been frozen solid bending smoothly, and began walking with unnatural grace toward a small depression in the snow approximately 30 meters away, where, Brennan realized with a sinking feeling, he could now make out what looked like a Soviet field radio partially buried in the snow, likely thrown from one of the destroyed vehicles during the Finnish ambush. The corpse reached the radio, knelt down with movements that were too fluid and coordinated for a body that should have weighed less than 40 kilograms, and began manipulating the equipment with its skeletal fingers. And then they heard it. A voice emerging from the radio that carried clearly across the frozen valley, speaking in Russian, but with an accent and pronunciation that sounded wrong, archaic, as if someone who had learned the language 1,000 years ago was trying to speak a modern dialect. And the message it transmitted made Brennan's heart hammer against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. All Soviet forces in Sector 7 Alpha, this is Reconnaissance Unit 423. We have secured the ridgeline position and identified American observer team coordinates. Follow request immediate artillery barrage on designated target. American forces are directing Finnish resistance operations and represent high-value elimination opportunity. Over. The transmission repeated twice more before the corpse simply stopped moving and collapsed back into the snow. Its purpose apparently served, and Brennan knew with absolute certainty that they had perhaps 10 minutes before Soviet artillery coordinates reached a fire direction center and shells began falling on their exact position. But more terrifyingly, he knew that the Untold had just demonstrated not just predatory intelligence, but tactical cunning, using the military radio network itself as a weapon to engineer a situation where more violence, more bloodshed, more deaths would occur on this sacred ground, feeding it more souls to harvest while simultaneously eliminating witnesses to its existence. Private Kowalski was already breaking down their equipment with panicked efficiency, stuffing gear into packs with no regard for organization, while Technical Sergeant Doherty had his service pistol drawn, though what he thought he could accomplish against an entity that consumed souls was unclear even to himself. And Corporal LaRue was scanning the forest behind them with wild eyes, searching for escape routes through terrain that was nearly impassable in daylight, and would be completely lethal to attempt in the darkness that was already beginning to gather as the weak Arctic afternoon faded toward another endless winter night. Brennan was about to give the order to move out, to abandon their position and equipment if necessary and make a run for the Finnish lines approximately 8 kilometers to the southwest, when Private Hutchins grabbed his arm and pointed with a shaking hand toward the valley floor, where the white figure had multiplied, where what had been one entity was now 3 identical forms, each standing motionless at approximately 50-meter intervals, forming a perfect triangle around the area where Brennan's team was positioned. And as he watched through binoculars that were becoming increasingly difficult to hold steady, he saw a 4th figure materialize from nothing at all, simply appearing in the space between one heartbeat and the next, as if reality itself had glitched and spawned another instance of this impossible predator. The temperature around their position plummeted so rapidly that Brennan could actually watch ice crystals forming on the exposed metal of their weapons, spreading across the surfaces in geometric patterns that looked almost like writing in some alien alphabet. And the static from Kellerman's radio intensified, resolving into what sounded like multiple voices overlapping, speaking in Sami and Old Norse and languages that had no modern names, all of them repeating variations of the same phrase that Corporal LaRue translated, with a voice that had gone flat with shock. The harvest begins. The harvest continues. The harvest will not end until the blood debt is paid, until the sacred ground is cleansed, until all who carry the weapons of war have given up their breath to feed the guardian, to feed the protector, to feed the Untold that was called, and cannot be dismissed until its purpose is fulfilled. The 4 white figures began moving with synchronized precision, that suggested a single controlling intelligence operating multiple bodies, simultaneously converging on the ridgeline from different angles in a coordinated pattern that would cut off every possible escape route, their gliding movement across the snow, leaving trails of that disturbing blue-gray discoloration that seemed to spread outward like frost patterns on glass. And as they approached, the temperature didn't just drop incrementally, but plummeted in waves that felt like physical blows, each pulse of supernatural cold hitting the team with enough force to make their lungs seize and their hearts stutter in their chests. Brennan gave the order to move with a hoarse shout that seemed to be swallowed by the thickening air, and the team scrambled from their observation post in a desperate attempt to reach the tree line behind them. But the moment they broke from cover, two more figures materialized directly in their path, and there it was possible to see in more detail what the creature really looked like, appearing with that same reality glitch effect, as if they had always been there but were only now choosing to become visible. And now the team was caught between 6 entities that were closing the distance with movements that seemed to accelerate and decelerate in ways that violated every law of physics and motion. The sky above them, which had been the typical gray-white overcast of an Arctic winter afternoon, began to darken in a way that had nothing to do with the natural progression of sunset, clouds swirling into spiral patterns that rotated around a central point directly above their position. And through gaps in the cloud cover, the sun itself appeared wrong, its light taking on a sickly green tinge that made the snow look like it was stained with some poisonous luminescence, while the shadows cast by trees and rocks began stretching and twisting into shapes that didn't correspond to any physical object, shadows that seemed to reach toward the fleeing soldiers with grasping appendages. Private Kowalski, who was carrying the heaviest pack, stumbled in the deep snow and went down hard, and when Technical Sergeant Doherty turned back to help him up, he let out a strangled cry of horror because Kowalski's shadow had separated from his body entirely, peeling away from the snow like a sheet of black paper and standing upright on its own, turning its head to look at its owner with eyeless regard, before beginning to walk toward him with the same gliding motion as the white figures. The boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was visibly disintegrating around them, the air itself taking on a translucent, gelatin-like quality that made movements feel sluggish and dreamlike, sound becoming distorted and echoing in ways that made it impossible to determine direction or distance, and reality was literally coming apart at the seams in response to the presence of these entities that existed partially in both worlds simultaneously, and whose mere manifestation in the material plane was enough to cause the fabric of normal physics to fray and tear like rotted cloth. Corporal Leroux began screaming in a mixture of English-French, his mind fracturing under the assault of phenomena that his rational brain simply could not process, his rifle forgotten in his hands, as he fell to his knees in the snow and started clawing at his own face, trying to tear away the skin because he could feel something underneath it. Something moving beneath the surface that wasn't muscle or bone, but rather the sensation of his own soul trying to escape his body in anticipation of what was coming. Lieutenant Kellerman, whose entire worldview had been built on logic and historical precedent and rational analysis, was laughing hysterically, while tears froze instantly on his cheeks, pulling documents and maps from his pack and trying to organize them into neat piles in the snow as if maintaining proper paperwork procedures could somehow restore order to a universe that had revealed itself to be far more terrifying and inexplicable than any academic framework could contain. Private Hutchins had his medical kit open and was injecting himself with morphine, not to dull physical pain, but in a desperate attempt to chemically force his mind into unconsciousness before he had to experience what happened when those entities reached him. His hand so steady with the needle that it was clear some part of his consciousness had already detached from reality entirely and was operating on pure mechanical training. The entities were now close enough that Brennan could see details that his mind wanted desperately to reject. The white fabric or material that shrouded them was not cloth at all, but rather something organic, something that moved and breathed and seemed to be made of countless tiny tendrils or filaments that waved gently as if underwater. And where those filaments touched the air, they left trails of frost that hung suspended in impossible spirals and helixes. The luminous eyes were not simple points of light, but rather openings into something else, portals or windows that looked into depths of cold and darkness that existed somewhere beyond space. And meeting that gaze, even for a fraction of a second, transmitted information directly into the brain without passing through normal sensory channels. Information about the age of these entities, about how long they had been waiting in their parallel realm, about how many souls they had harvested over millennia of serving as guardians for ground that humans had long forgotten was sacred, about the hunger that came not from malice but from function, from purpose, from being called into service and bound by ancient contracts to complete a task regardless of how many lives that task consumed. Technical Sergeant Doherty's service pistol was in his hand, but he wasn't aiming it at the approaching entities anymore. He was pressing the barrel against his own temple, his finger white on the trigger, calculating in some distant corner of his rational mind that a self-inflicted death might be preferable to what awaited him if those things reached him and began the extraction process. But his hand was shaking so badly that he couldn't bring himself to complete the action, some fundamental survival instinct overriding even the terror of what approached. Private Kowalski was speaking in rapid Polish, prayers his immigrant parents had taught him, begging for intercession or mercy, or at least the grace of a quick death, while his own shadow continued its independent approach, reaching toward him with arms that stretched impossibly long, fingers that split into multiple digits like branches of a winter tree. And when those shadow fingers finally touched his leg, he went completely rigid and silent, his eyes rolling back in his head until only the whites showed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. The equipment they carried was now behaving in ways that transcended simple malfunction and entered the realm of active hostility. Brennan's wristwatch was running backward, its hands spinning counterclockwise at accelerating speed as if time itself was being rewound. Kellerman's compass had begun spinning so rapidly that the needle was just a blur, and the glass face had cracked from the centrifugal force, and the radio unit was emitting sounds that approximated human speech, but were constructed from harmonics and frequencies that human vocal cords could never produce. Each word causing physical pain in the inner ear like ice picks being driven through the eardrums directly into the brain, and the message it conveyed was clear despite the alien method of transmission. There would be no escape, no rescue, no survival, only the harvest, only the extraction, only the payment of the blood debt that had been incurred when weapons of war were brought to this sacred ground without permission, without respect, without understanding the ancient treaties that governed such spaces. The 6 entities had formed a perfect circle around Brennan's team, with a radius of perhaps 20 meters, close enough now that the cold they emanated was causing exposed skin to blacken with instant frostbite, close enough that the team could hear the sound they made, a sound like wind passing through a vast empty space, like breath drawn through dead lungs, like the whisper of countless voices speaking in unison from somewhere impossibly distant. And that sound carried words in Old Norse that Brennan somehow understood, despite having no knowledge of the language. Understood because the meaning was being transmitted directly into his consciousness. You who carry weapons to the sacred circle, you who spill blood upon the consecrated ground, you who violate the ancient compact between the people and the protectors, your breath is forfeit, your essence is claimed, your souls are the payment demanded for transgression, and we who were called to defend will harvest what is owed until the debt is satisfied and the ground is cleansed. The entities began to move inward in perfect synchronization, closing the circle with mathematical precision, and as they approached, the reality distortions intensified to the point where Brennan could no longer trust any of his senses. He could see his own body from outside himself looking down at a terrified soldier, kneeling in the snow clutching a rifle that had turned to ice in his hands. He could hear his own heartbeat echoing through the forest like thunder, could feel his soul beginning to loosen in its physical housing like a tooth working free from diseased gums, that terrible sensation of something fundamental pulling away from its moorings. All around the circle, his team was experiencing similar dissociation. Lieutenant Kellerman was watching his own memories play out in reverse in the air before him, like a film running backward, seeing his entire life from death toward birth rushing past in accelerating sequence. Technical Sergeant Doherty was feeling his body temperature drop, not just in his skin but in his core, in his blood, in his bones, becoming so cold that his flesh turned brittle and began to crack like porcelain. Small fissures appearing on his hands and face that wept no blood but rather wisps of that same dark vapor that the first Soviet victim had released. The nearest entity, perhaps 5 meters away now, extended what might have been arms from beneath its shroud. and Brennan could see that these were not limbs in any conventional sense, but rather negative spaces, absences of matter that were somehow substantial, voids shaped like hands that reached not to grab but to draw, to pull, to extract. And he understood with the clarity that comes in moments before death that what was about to happen would be worse than any physical torture, worse than burning or freezing or bleeding to death, because this was the annihilation not just of the body, but of the essential self, the consciousness, the soul. Whatever component of being continues after the heart stops and the brain shuts down, that would be consumed, absorbed, obliterated as payment for violating boundaries he hadn't even known existed. Private Kowalski was the first to begin the extraction process, his mouth opening impossibly wide as something dark and viscous began to flow from his throat, his eyes, his nose, streaming toward the entity that stood over him like smoke drawn up a chimney. And the sound he made was not a scream, but rather a keening wail that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously, as if every version of himself that existed across all possible timelines was dying at once, and their combined death cries were merging into a single chorus of absolute despair. Corporal LaRue went next, his body convulsing violently as the extraction began, his French prayers dissolving into wordless howls, and Brennan could see the man's essence leaving him, could actually perceive the soul as a tangible thing being drawn out and consumed, and watching it happen to someone else was somehow more horrifying than experiencing it himself, because it confirmed that this was real. This was happening. This was not hallucination or madness, but rather an objective reality where ancient forces could be awakened and bound to purposes that transcended human morality or mercy. The entities were now close enough to touch, their void appendages reaching toward Brennan's chest, and he could feel his own extraction about to begin, could feel that terrible pulling sensation starting deep in his core, and his last coherent thought before the process consumed his consciousness entirely was a desperate prayer, not to any god, but to whatever spark of humanity might remain in these ancient guardians, a wordless plea for mercy that he knew even as he formed. It would go unheeded because mercy was a human concept, and these entities operated on principles far older and far more absolute than compassion or forgiveness, principles of debt and payment and balance that cared nothing for individual suffering or the value of human life, principles that would see him and his entire team reduced to dried husks in the snow. Empty vessels that had once contained something precious, but were now just organic debris to be forgotten by history and classified into non-existence by authorities desperate to maintain the comfortable fiction that reality operated according to rules humanity could understand and control. The extraction process had progressed for perhaps 15 seconds, that eternity of agony, where Brennan felt his very essence being torn from its physical housing, when the forest erupted with a sound that somehow cut through the supernatural distortion. The distinctive crack of Finnish ski troops Suomi KP-31 submachine guns firing in rapid controlled bursts, followed immediately by the deeper boom of Soviet artillery shells impacting the valley floor approximately 800 meters to the east, the combination of sudden violence and explosive force creating a shockwave that rippled through the destabilized reality around the extraction site. The entities froze mid-harvest, their void appendages still extended but suddenly motionless, and through vision that was fracturing into multiple overlapping perspectives, Brennan saw what had caused the interruption. A full company of Finnish ski troops, at least 60 white camouflaged soldiers appearing like ghosts from the forest, were engaged in a running firefight with what appeared to be a Soviet infantry battalion that had been pursuing them, and the two forces had collided directly in the sacred ground, approximately 300 meters from where the American team was being harvested, bringing fresh violence, fresh bloodshed, fresh targets to ground that the Unscoti had been summoned to defend. The entities released their partial holds on Brennan's team with a suddenness that was physically violent, the extraction process reversing so abruptly that it felt like being slapped back into their bodies from a great distance, and every man collapsed into the snow, gasping and retching, their souls snapping back into physical housing with trauma that would leave psychological scars deeper than any combat injury. Through eyes that were streaming with tears that froze instantly on his face, Brennan watched as all 6 entities turned away from his team with perfect synchronization, and began moving with terrifying speed toward the battlefield that had erupted below them, gliding across the snow at velocities that should have been impossible. And behind them, the reality distortions began to collapse. The swirling sky returning to normal overcast gray, the twisted shadows snapping back to their proper shapes, the gelatin-thick air thinning to normal atmospheric consistency, as if the entities were taking their influence with them toward their new targets. The sounds of combat intensified as the Unscoti reached the edge of the firefight, and even from their elevated position, Brennan's team could hear the screaming begin, could hear both Finnish and Soviet soldiers encountering something that their military training had never prepared them for, could hear the distinctive reports of weapons fire becoming sporadic and panicked as discipline broke down in the face of entities that consumed souls with indiscriminate efficiency. Private Kowalski was alive but barely conscious, his body having lost perhaps 15 kilograms during the partial extraction, his skin gray and papery, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. And when Private Hutchins checked his vital signs with shaking hands, he found a pulse that was thready and irregular, breathing that was shallow and labored, as if some portion of the man's essential animating force had been permanently removed despite the interruption. Lieutenant Kellerman was curled in the fetal position in the snow, weeping uncontrollably and speaking in fragmented sentences that made no chronological sense, his mind apparently stuck experiencing multiple time frames simultaneously, while Technical Sergeant Doherty's hands and face showed spiderweb patterns of fine cracks in the skin, where his flesh had begun to crystallize during the near-death experience, fissures that oozed clear fluid rather than blood. Corporal LaRue was the first to regain something approaching functional consciousness, his survival instincts overriding the psychological trauma as he grabbed Brennan's shoulder and shook him with desperate strength, his voice hoarse and damaged as if he'd been screaming for hours. "Sarge, we need to move now while those things are distracted. This is our only chance. We leave the gear. We leave everything, we just run, and we don't stop running until we're out of this forest or dead. Those are the only two options left." The sounds of combat below were already changing, the volume of weapons fire decreasing as soldiers died or fled, being replaced by a chorus of screaming that echoed through the valley in waves. And Brennan knew with certainty that LaRue was right, that whatever mercy or luck or divine intervention had caused their reprieve would not extend indefinitely, that the entities would complete their harvest of the fresh targets and then return to finish what they had started with the American team, unless they could put enough distance between themselves and this cursed ground before that happened. The escape through the frozen forest was a nightmare of endurance that pushed every man to the absolute limits of physical capability and beyond, dragging and carrying Kowalski's semi-conscious body through deep snow and darkness that was nearly absolute, following compass bearings that became trustworthy again, only after they'd covered approximately 5 kilometers from the harvest site. Their progress marked by the gradual return of normal physical sensations as the supernatural cold released its grip and was replaced by the merely lethal natural temperature of an Arctic winter night. They reached a Finnish forward operating post at 0347 hours on December 19th, 17 hours after the initial encounter, and were immediately surrounded by armed soldiers who took one look at their condition and summoned medical personnel, and more ominously, a man in the uniform of a Finnish army captain but whose insignia and bearing suggested intelligence services rather than regular military, Captain Erkki Virtanen, a man in his late 50s with eyes that suggested he'd seen things that regular soldiers were never exposed to, dismissed the medical staff after their initial examination, and sat down across from Brennan in a heated tent that felt like paradise after the frozen hell of the forest. And without preamble or small talk, he said in perfect English with a slight British accent, "You encountered the Unscoti, you witnessed the harvest, and somehow you survived despite being caught in the extraction process, which makes you either extremely lucky or extremely cursed. I haven't decided which yet." Virtanen explained, with the weariness of someone repeating information he'd delivered too many times before, that the Finnish High Command had been aware of the risk when they'd allowed a desperate group of Sami villagers to perform the summoning ritual 3 weeks earlier, had known that calling the Ancient Guardian would result in indiscriminate casualties that would include their own forces, but the calculation had been simple and brutal. The Unscoti would kill hundreds or perhaps thousands of Soviet soldiers, while the alternative was subjugation of the entire nation. And from a strategic perspective, the exchange was acceptable, even knowing that the entities would also claim Finnish lives and couldn't be controlled once awakened. The captain's face was grim as he laid out what would happen next. Brennan's team would be transferred immediately to a facility near Helsinki, under the guise of treatment for severe cold weather injuries. They would be debriefed by both Finnish and American intelligence personnel, who specialized in what he termed non-conventional warfare phenomena. Their official reports would be classified at levels that effectively removed them from all accessible military records, and they would be required to sign documents that threatened everything from court-martial to permanent institutionalization if they ever spoke about what they'd witnessed. 2 Finnish intelligence officers entered the tent carrying equipment that Brennan recognized from his training as document destruction materials, thermite grenades specifically, and Virtanen explained that a bomber sortie had already been authorized for first light. Finnish Bristol Blenheim aircraft loaded with incendiary bombs that would reduce the entire sacred ground area to ash and scorched earth, destroying any physical evidence of the harvest while also, hopefully, convincing the Sami elders to perform the dismissal ritual that would send the Anskoti back to their realm before the body count climbed into the thousands. The aerial bombardment occurred at 0612 hours, visible even from their distance as a horizon of orange flame that turned the pre-dawn darkness into artificial daylight, and Brennan watched the smoke rising and wondered how many of those Finnish and Soviet soldiers they'd heard screaming had survived the night. How many had been reduced to dried husks in the snow? How many souls had been harvested to pay a debt that those soldiers hadn't even known they were incurring, simply by bringing weapons of war to ground that ancient treaties had marked as forbidden? The team was separated within 48 hours of their return to civilization, each man transferred to different locations with different cover stories. Kowalski to a veteran's psychiatric facility in Maryland, where he would spend the next 3 years as a nonverbal patient, before finally regaining some capacity for speech. Hutchins to a medical research position at Walter Reed, where his experiences would inform classified studies on extreme trauma response. Kellerman to a desk position in military history archives, where he would spend the rest of his career cataloging documents he was forbidden to discuss. Doherty to an engineering position at Los Alamos, where his security clearance made him unemployable anywhere else. And LaRue simply disappeared from all records entirely, his service jacket stamped with classifications that suggested his knowledge was deemed too dangerous for him to remain in normal society. Brennan himself was promoted to major and assigned to a newly created office within Army intelligence. That officially didn't exist, a position that involved reviewing reports from combat zones worldwide, where soldiers encountered phenomena that conventional military doctrine couldn't explain or accommodate. And he would spend the next 23 years reading testimonies that echoed his own experience, learning that the Anskoti were far from unique, that every culture had their guardians and their forbidden grounds, and that modern warfare was bringing soldiers into contact with forces that had been carefully avoided by indigenous peoples for millennia. Forces that didn't care about politics or ideology, or the righteousness of any cause. Forces that simply existed to maintain boundaries that humans had forgotten or chosen to ignore, in their arrogant assumption that they controlled the world they lived in. The final entry in Brennan's classified file, written 3 days before his retirement in 1962, contained a single haunting observation. On clear winter nights, I still dream of those luminous eyes, and sometimes I wake convinced that the extraction was never truly interrupted, that I'm still kneeling in that frozen forest watching my soul being pulled from my body, and everything since then has been just the hallucination of a dying mind, trying to convince itself it survived. And the worst part is not knowing whether this reality is genuine or whether I'm still there, still dying, still being harvested by something ancient and hungry that saw my soul as nothing more than payment for a debt I didn't know I owed. The official military records concerning the events of December 18th and 1939, in the Lapland region of northern Finland, were sanitized with ruthless efficiency by a joint intelligence operation involving American OSS precursor agencies, Finnish military intelligence, and surprisingly, elements of Soviet NKVD who had their own reasons for wanting the truth buried beneath layers of plausible deniability and bureaucratic misdirection. The American observer team was officially documented as having suffered severe casualties due to accidental exposure to experimental Finnish cold weather munitions testing, with Private Leonard Kozlowski receiving a medical discharge for combat-related neurological trauma with permanent cognitive impairment. His VA file containing detailed fabrications about shrapnel wounds and blast wave brain damage that explained his condition without ever mentioning the word soul or extraction anywhere in the hundreds of pages of false documentation. Private First Class William Hutchins was officially commended for his medical service during the Winter War and transferred to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where he was assigned to a research division that officially studied extreme environmental stress response in combat personnel, but which actually maintained files on over 300 separate incidents worldwide involving phenomena that suggested human consciousness could be targeted, extracted or consumed by non-physical entities. His office located in a sub-basement that required 4 separate security clearances to access, and whose very existence was omitted from building floor plans and architectural documents. Lieutenant Robert Hayes Kellerman's brilliant academic career was quietly ended through bureaucratic maneuvers that resulted in his assignment to a military archive facility in Fort Meade, where he spent 31 years cataloging classified documents that he was forbidden to read, discuss, or contextualize. His clearance level, specifically structured to ensure he could handle the physical materials without ever gaining comprehensive knowledge of what they contained, a psychological torture that left him a hollow shell who would eventually take his own life in 1970 with a service pistol he'd kept hidden in violation of his psychiatric treatment restrictions. His suicide note containing only a single sentence in Old Norse that the military censors couldn't translate, but which a Finnish linguistic consultant would later identify as, "The harvest never ends, only pauses." Technical Sergeant James Patrick Doherty was transferred to the Manhattan Project's successor programs at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where his engineering expertise was utilized in weapons development. But his true value to the program was never his technical knowledge, but rather his first-hand experience with what internal documents referred to as non-conventional threat vectors, and he would spend his career helping to design contingency protocols for scenarios where American military forces might encounter entities or phenomena that conventional weapons couldn't address. Corporal Vincent LaRue's fate was the most disturbing because he simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. His service records were not classified, but rather completely expunged. His family was informed that he had died in a training accident, with his body lost in a vehicle fire that was hot enough to prevent recovery of remains. The physical evidence from the harvest site was eliminated with extreme prejudice. The Finnish Air Force bombardment was followed by a ground team that used flamethrowers to ensure complete incineration of any organic material in a 3 square kilometer radius. Then Soviet artillery conducted what they officially termed routine targeting exercises that cratered the entire valley floor. And finally, after the Winter War ended, a joint Finnish-Soviet effort that was never officially acknowledged resulted in the construction of a military testing range that covered the coordinates in question, ensuring that civilian access would be prevented indefinitely under the guise of unexploded ordnance dangers that would never be fully cleared. But there is a reality far stranger and more dangerous than the sanitized version governments allow their citizens to believe, and the price for ignoring these limits is not measured in violated treaties or broken laws, but in souls consumed, essences harvested, consciousness extinguished not into a peaceful non-existence, but into something far worse, something ancient peoples understood, feared, and respected, something modern civilization has forgotten at its own existential peril. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.